Hello, fellow developers. This is Eder Ignatovic, your chair for the upcoming InfoQ Dev Summit in Boston. If you're looking to stay ahead on the critical topics like generative AI, security, modern web applications, and more, learn directly from over 20 senior software practitioners navigating this challenge as they share their experience and practical insights you can apply immediately. Plus, there is a plenty of time for you to connect with peers and speakers at your social events. InfoQ Dev Summit is brought to you by the team behind InfoQ and the QCon International Software Developer Conference. Find out more at devsummit.infoq.com. I'm looking forward to connecting to you in Boston this June. See you there.
Hello and welcome to the InfoQ podcast. I'm Thomas Betts, and today I'm talking with Sophia Prater about object-oriented UX. We'll be talking about how OOUX framework helps digital product designers create naturally intuitive user experiences. And since I like to say that every software problem is fundamentally a communication problem, I'm also interested in how OOUX can improve communication among designers, product owners, engineers, and architects. So Sophia, welcome to the InfoQ podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So first, please tell me a little bit about yourself and your involvement with OOUX.
Yeah, so my name is Sophia Prater, and I consider myself the chief evangelist for object-oriented UX. I allegedly coined the term. I did not coin, of course, object-oriented or UX, but I shoved them together. People in the 90s were using terms like object-oriented UI, so it was not a huge leap for me to start using the term object-oriented UX. And it kind of all started with modular design and responsive design and trying to think about how do I create designs that are using the least effective dose of moving parts. So my granddad was a chemical nuclear engineer, and he always said, the more moving parts, the more likely it is to break. And I just grew up with that in my head. When responsive design came to town around 2011, 2012, and all of a sudden I was designing for a moving canvas, that became so much more important. And so what I thought I was doing is I thought I was doing modular design, kind of the precursor to a design system. And then what I realized I was doing was actually identifying not the components, but the entities that the components housed. So I was working at CNN, and I wasn't so concerned with like the cards and the details and the sliders and the navigation elements. I was trying to figure out what are the things within an election. I was working on the election results. So I was thinking, okay, we've got races, we've got states, we've got candidates. And how do I keep those as consistent as possible? Because I don't need those things changing around, because as soon as we have two different versions of the candidate card, that has to now be across all of these devices. Those two different versions, those two arbitrarily different candidate cards now have to be designed for mobile, for tablet, for desktop, and the QA, it kind of just gets exponential, right? So that's kind of where it all started, was this idea of thinking about what the entities are. And I was doing it from a design perspective. And also then I started looking into the psychology behind it and how people actually think and how people identify objects in their environment, and really to be able to function properly in an environment, whether that is a physical environment or a digital environment. What the brain does is it identifies what the objects are. And even for folks that have visual disabilities, they are still doing that. They're using amazing coping mechanisms to also identify what the objects are in a given space. So I got into the psychology of object-oriented UX and how it benefits from a user perspective. And then finally, I came around, and this is before I was even calling it object-oriented UX, I came around to recognizing this is how developers are thinking too. They're thinking in data, they're thinking in databases, they're thinking in how these databases relate to each other and how data is passed. And I was realizing that, oh my gosh, what I've been doing in my career, the first 5 years of my career, is I've been showing a bunch of flows, a bunch of static screens in a flow. Sometimes they were fancy and you could click through them. And then the developer was looking at those screens and then reverse engineering them to figure out a data model. And I was like, this doesn't seem like the most efficient way to work. Maybe we could work together on this data model from a user-centered perspective, make that data model, that domain model really, really clear and really aligned with how users think about the environment and the domain.
Yeah, I think that you kind of got to one of my first questions going to be like, well, this is how like object-oriented programming is how we've been doing software for decades. Like it's pretty much the only way I've known to do business applications. And I think that's true for most of the InfoQ audience. And you really only need the designer for those business, customer facing applications. You don't need it for a shell script, whatever. You guys aren't doing, some user interface and UX design. So I think the naive aspect of, a developer thinking of this is, well, isn't that how you always think of it? Think of it in objects, but that's not how the designers, you think about those workflows, and that's been the difference. And that's how OOUX is different than a traditional approach to designing.
Yes, a traditional approach to design is very verb focused instead of noun focused. And my hypothesis on why that is because of we kind of got our name around the e-commerce revolution, and we started getting to be at the table for usability testing because people needed to go through a transaction. They needed to get from point A to point B, and often our metrics are on conversions. So being able to get, and often that conversion was like, did they successfully get their credit card information in there? And did they purchase the product? So those were some of those original usability tests of how do we get a user from point A to point B for that cha-ching, right? So we kind of, that's like in our DNA, even though a lot of UX did evolve from information architecture, which was about organizing information. But in information architecture, a lot of that information was very kind of taxonomy based and organizing pages, not necessarily different types of content objects. So when you look at traditional user experience design, and basically how user experience design is by and large practiced today, it is very flow based. Let's start with the flows. Let's start with how a user moves through it. And all that is so important. It is so, so important to figure out the verbs in a system, but it's way easier to figure out the verbs in a system if you've already defined the nouns, and then you can kind of iterate back and forth. So what are the things in this space? And then figure out what do people want to do to those things. And basically, that's the crux of the process, is figuring out those nouns, figuring out those things that users are actually coming for, that they care about, that they expect to be there, that you're going to need to build your databases and your APIs around. What are those things that need to be shown, and what is their structure? And then figuring out what do people want to do to those. And then, of course, you iterate back and forth.
And I think that's where it starts to sound a lot like object-oriented design, that you have your classes and they have properties of the data elements inside them, and they have behavior. Here are those verbs you can do. I want to save the invoice. I want to save the order or delete it or whatever it is. And you're saying that that now gets brought into the design aspect, not just the architecture design side of like, here's where all the objects are and here's my UML diagram. You're talking about doing that as part of that user flow, thinking about those things.
100%. And I've had some of the developers that I've worked with, and also very early in my career, I got to work with a lot of software engineers. I was working in startups. So I was usually the one UX designer surrounded by software engineers. And I still remember one of them saying, like, kind of jokingly, because he was loving the process, but also saying, like, you're kind of taking the fun part away from what I do. And I was like, no, we're just doing it together now so that we could be on the same page. And it is going to be a little bit different. So from a UX perspective and from an object-oriented UX perspective, I'm thinking about the objects that are user-facing. Right? I am thinking about the attributes that are user-facing. I am thinking about the relationships that are user-facing, how somebody's going to navigate through. And just to kind of get some terminology clear, when I'm saying objects, you're probably thinking classes. I kind of use the philosopher term of the objects, and then I use the term instances for the actual lines in the database would be the instances. So in object-oriented UX, we basically work with developers to figure out what are those things. And it is very, very similar to, I would say, like, the philosophy is so similar to domain-driven design, very similar to what you might do. I think you mentioned the entity relationship diagram or UML or something like that. So I think that your audience is just going to be really interested. And unfortunately, this is an audio podcast, but the diagrams that we create in the object-oriented process and in the ORCA process. So ORCA stands for objects, relationships, calls to actions, and attributes. We go through 4 rounds of ORCA to get to basically really, really solid requirements that describe the O's, the R's, the C's, and the A's from a user perspective. Now, a software architect could go through that entire process and do it also from a back-end perspective and use this exact same process, and it would feel very familiar. The cool thing about the artifacts that we create within this process is that they're really, really scalable. The problem with an entity relationship diagram is once you have 60, 70 objects, once you have 10 objects in an entity relationship diagram, And maybe some of those objects have dozens of attributes in them. It gets a little bit untenable. You get a bowl of spaghetti. It gets a little bit unreadable. And a lot of the systems that I work on and then I work on with my clients and my students work on have triple digit objects, user facing objects. And from a technical perspective, you're going to have even more objects. There's probably going to be some non user facing objects as well that you would need to be dealing with, right? So even user facing concepts, Autodesk, who I got to work with recently, easily 300 objects in their ecosystem. Try to make an entity relationship diagram with 300 objects, right? And some of those having hundreds of attributes. So what our artifacts do, the object map is scalable. So that was what I was really running into, is doing boxes and arrows is really great when you have a handful of objects and a handful of relationships. But even when you start having multiple relationships between two objects, if you're trying to map multiple different types of relationships, just taking something as simple as a person in a post. So a person has many posts that they've created. A post has one person who created it, right? Okay, great. But a person can also have many posts that they've saved, or have many posts that they've liked, or have many posts that they've created that are in draft state. So there could easily be 6, 7 different flavors of relationships between something as simple as a person and a post. Trying to do all of that with crow's feet or an entity relationship diagram can get really, really messy and difficult to read and difficult to collaborate on.
Well, yeah, and I think that's one of the struggles that a lot of architects find is how do we communicate our design and say, okay, these are the relationships. And when you see that one line with the little crow's feet, you're like, oh, that's it. It's just one thing. And you don't realize that that might mean 6 different things. And there's no way to stack that up. And if you do stack it up, is it clear what those mean? And yes, I've seen the diagram where, oh, we'll put everything on it and it becomes like a PDF the size of Montana in order to be able to read the legibility of the text on it. And it's not useful for anyone to comprehend.
Right. And if we just think about relationships, just the relationships, not even thinking about the calls to action, the operations on the object or the attributes, the properties, just thinking about the relationships are so, so important. I will give your listeners, I'll try to describe the nested object matrix just to like give you something right now to kind of help you document that. Because again, those boxes and arrows, you can do little whiteboard diagrams, but really digging deep with a cross-functional group and collaborating on those relationships. And again, collaborating on those relationships from a mental model perspective, like how do users think about how these things connect to each other? You can do something called a nested object matrix. So basically, you put your objects across the x-axis and you put your objects, again, the exact same objects down the y-axis, and you map the relationships through the intersections. So this is a way you can systematically go through it too, so that you're not missing any relationships. Because again, if you're just boxes and arrows, there you have one box and the other box is on the other side of the whiteboard, and they might not get connected, even if they are actually connected in the mental model, and they should be connected in the system. So you can do this nested object matrix, start mapping out all the relationships, describe the cardinality. If you've got 6 to 7 relationships in one cell, you just stack those sticky notes. So you can do this in sticky notes, do this in Miro, in Mural, you can do this in Notion, you can do it in Airtable or whatever tool, and you basically build a matrix instead of doing it in boxes and arrows or doing both.
And that's what I was going to ask. How do you do the multiple? And you're saying that intersection, it's not just a single point of intersection. It can be all the different relationships are in there. That's useful.
Yeah, I will put maybe 10 sticky notes in that one cell between so you basically think of your top ones, I call them the host objects, and you can just read it in natural language. So I might say an article, and then if I'm in the post row, I would say an article, I'm sorry, not a post, an author or person has many posts that they've created, has many posts in draft, has many posts that they've liked, has many posts that they've saved, has many posts that they've commented on, right? So you could have all of those relationships just stacked up and it scales beautifully.
I think that's one of those challenges of seeing all those relationships and getting those captured in requirements. This actually came up in a discussion this morning on one of my teams was I'm solving this one problem that's a cross-cutting concern. It's like everyone has this type of relationship, but I'm solving it for my data. And someone else has that same relationship with their data. Am I supposed to solve all of those problems? And is it documented in the requirements that I'm actually solving all those requirements? There might be 5 different things I should be checking for, but I'm only handling on this one screen for this one data type. And getting all those relationships spelled out is very, very useful to be able to then look at the requirements and someone can check off, we can meet all these requirements.
Exactly. And in a meta sense, you're objectifying the relationship. You're creating a little card, whether it's a sticky note and mural. We love using Notion and Airtable in the OUX world. You're creating a thing that represents that relationship in one way of that relationship. It's a two-way street. So you have a one card, if you will, for a person has many articles that they've created, and you have another card for an article has one person who created it. And then what you can do is you can put your documentation on that relationship between the two things. And then if you need to copy and paste because you have that relationship that is in two different systems, right? And in different requirements. But then you can go in there, and what we do in the requirements round of the ORCA process, what we do is for every single relationship, we look at what we call my cat saving fire department. And that stands for the mechanics. So what is the mechanics? How do these things actually connect? How do they get connected, right? Is it by a user, manually hitting a button? Is it by a user action? Is it by an API? Is it a system recommendation? So is it automatically being connected? Is it a content creator and a CMS connecting these things manually? Like, how are they actually getting connected? Then we go through the cardinality. So we get deeper in the cardinality. So instead of just saying a person has many posts that they've created, we're going to say a person has many posts that they've created, but on average, how many posts does a person create within our system? Is there a maximum number? So this is getting into that performance question. So I know in your world, performance is a big issue. So we can start talking about that super early as the UX designers are designing it. And we're saying, okay, like, is there a maximum? How many do we actually expect in this particular system? Are people on average creating like 10 posts, or is it averaging 5,000 posts? That's going to have different implications there with performance, as well as also mapping all those relationships and seeing how you might pull through information through those relationships.
Yeah, that's a useful example because architects are concerned with the quality attributes of the system. And so performance is probably related to how much data, and if the relationships are the data, the relationships are just as important as the articles, the posts, the authors. How does that scale? And so if you can establish early and say, our requirements expect this, or maybe for your MVP, for the first year, maybe someone's going to create 10 posts a day. So the maximum is going to be about 3,500 in a year. But fine, we can scale to that level. They're not going to create 3 million. One person isn't going to do that. So you can get that written down, and then your architecture can be just enough to support those use cases. And having that quantified early is always very helpful.
Yeah, I mean, number of instances is something that we go through, right off the bat. I mean, number of instances when it comes to connections, and also when it comes to like the object overall. So we create something called an object guide. And one of the sections of the object guide is how many instances do we expect, within the first couple months, within the first couple years, people or posts or events, so that we can start gauging that idea. And it's from a design perspective, it's a huge implication from a design perspective. So that's really like been my main concern. And then the more I grow up as a designer and learn, this is a performance implication too, as well. But to go back to my cat saving fire department, we have the mechanics, the cardinality, and then we have sorting and filtering. And so this is why, okay, if I have a person has many posts and I expect them to have about 5 posts, I don't need to worry so much about sorting and filtering. If I'm on a person detail page, like there's just their 5 posts. But if we're averaging 500 posts on a person, I probably need to provide the user with sort and filter mechanisms. So I can start looking at that right there. What are the sort and filter mechanisms of posts within context of a person? And then the last one is dependency. So if somebody deletes their account, what happens to those posts? Are the posts dependent on the author object? And this is just things that most of the time designers don't think about. And we throw it over and we leave it to the developers. And it's like, y'all have enough to think about. This should come from user research. What do users actually expect? Like for the dependency question, this is major implications. Like thinking about Yelp. If a restaurant closes on Yelp, what happens to all the reviews? Do the reviews go away? Do they stay there? Do people who have reviewed the restaurant get alerted if the restaurant closes? What actually happens? But this has big implications when it comes to architecture as well.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. So I wanted to go back. You've mentioned ORCA a couple times. Walk me through the whole process. Spell out the acronym again. And then what are you doing? I want to understand the techniques that you're using to walk people through this process. And why do you do it 4 times?
Yes. Iterate, iterate, iterate. So ORCA, objects, relationships, calls to action, and attributes. So objects, what are the things? What are the things that people actually care about? We do something called noun foraging, which AI is getting better and better at doing that. We're definitely using some tools for noun foraging now. I used to do that manually, but basically looking at a bunch of data, whether that is user interviews, customer chat logs, the vision deck from the CEO, whatever, right? Subject matter expert interviews, and we're looking for the nouns. We're looking for the nouns that we hear over and over and over again. We're looking for nouns that have structure, instances, and purpose. Okay, so that's what we call SIP. And we do a little champagne cheers every time we find an object that has structure, instances, and purpose. So the first round is discovery. We're just figuring out, okay, what are we working with here? And in that first round of figuring out your objects, your relationships, your calls to action, your attributes is all about asking just really good questions. It is like shining a light in all the dark, dirty corners, shining a floodlight. I sometimes make the metaphor from a design perspective. I'm sure this is true in your world as well. When it comes to requirements and scope and what are we actually building, it sometimes feels like you've got like a old dim flashlight with like the batteries are kind of flickering in and out, and you kind of look in one and you see a little bit of the picture over here and you see a little bit of the picture over there, and then you move the flashlight back and the picture's changed. So this is like, let's just turn on the floodlight and figure out, what are we actually building here? What do we not know? What are the unknown unknowns? And so we can ask a whole lot of really good questions. So we start with that, figuring out what those objects are. We do a first round of a nested object matrix. Then we go into a call to action matrix. We go ahead and go into roles. So right off the bat, we're thinking about roles and permissions. I know that's another big concern on your side, is security and permissions and like, who can see what? So that is also something that traditionally UX designers are not great about thinking about until much later on, or they'll just think about the one user, right? Oh, we're just designing for this user right now. And then later on the next sprint, we'll design for the other user. Don't love that approach. It would be like, the metaphor I give for that one is like an architect, like an actual building architect, saying, oh, we're going to design this bank, but we're just going to design the customer side of the bank first. We're not going to worry about what happens behind the counter. That would be ludicrous way to design a building, right? To just design for one side of the story. So we go into the call to action matrix. That is, we figure out our roles. We have roles on one axis, on the y-axis, and then across the x-axis, we've got our objects, and then we put the verbs in the middle. So what can these different roles do to these different things? And then we go into the attributes. And that's where the object map, the holy grail of the ORCA process, it's basically, we've got that nested object matrix and we start adding attributes. It's a very beautifully color-coded diagram, which includes, we separate metadata from core content. So we have the two different types of attributes. So core content being our unique identifiers, our titles, names, images, that kind of thing. A lot of the time, the more unstructured content. And then we have our metadata, that's our more structured content that users are typically going to be sorting and filtering by. So we go ahead and start separating that. That's a discovery round. We're usually on sticky notes. We're loosey-goosey. We're figuring out all the questions. We often have to go back to research. And then we go through a requirements round. That's when we basically put everything under a microscope. And we go back through the O's, the R's, the C's, the A's. We built an object guide, which is like a glossary on steroids. We go deep with our nested objects and go through that, my cat setting fire department. We also get a little bit more into inheritance. We will, from a design perspective, create object bases. I know inheritance is a little bit of a touchy subject, but from a user perspective, sometimes it's really good to know that we have people objects, but every person object is either going to be a celebrity or a fan within this, whatever Hollywood website that we're making, right? There's never any just people objects. You're either going to be a celebrity or a fan, but there's a lot of stuff in common. So we'll start pulling out some things into bases, like little starter kits for objects. We look into junction objects. We've got something that we call tree systems. So we get a little bit more into hierarchies of objects and just get a little bit more detail. Then in the CTA, I told you it's 15 steps. I'll summarize this as best as possible, giving it all away here. And then for the requirements with the calls to action, we basically build object-oriented user stories. We already have the who is doing it, what are they doing it, to what object. We go deeper with the why and the when. So why are they doing it? Do we have a really good reason Do we understand the user's motivations for why they are actually acting on this object? And when are they doing it? In what context? Is there any conditions that need to be met before they can do this thing? So we get into a little bit of conditional logic there. And then we go and we get deeper with the attributes. I won't get into that. The third round is prioritization. Now that we have a really good picture of our O's, our R's, our C's, and our A's, we can prioritize from a user perspective and a business perspective our O's, our R's, our C's, and our A's. So we can say, this is what we're launching with first. And based on what we're launching with, and there's this great trickle down effect. You eliminate some objects. Well, then you're eliminating relationships, you're eliminating CTAs, you're eliminating attributes. So our templates do a pretty good job of that to kind of trickle it down. And we can say, this is what we're building first. And then from a user perspective, what objects are most important? What attributes? So like, what's more important on the post? Is it the timestamp or is it the author? Like, this is a really simple example, but we want to keep that consistent as possible throughout the experience so we can actually prioritize that. Again, like before, we haven't gotten any screens yet. It's not until that last round where we start getting into screens. And we have OOUX style sketching, which really helps ensure that we can keep all those objects really nicely consistent and basically creating that beautiful modular design based on the objects. I know that was a lot.
It was a lot, but there were so many points that I'm like, that's how you should be designing software. And it goes back to that almost naive approach. Like, well, isn't that how you've been doing it? But if you're thinking just flow-based, like, oh, the user is going to create a post and they hit save and we're done, and that's all you describe, you missed out on a lot of things, which gets to one of the big problems in software development is the requirements are missing the details. And then the developer is told, go and build the user creates a new post and saves it. And here's the wireframe and figure it out. And from there, they have to then decide, well, what's the data model? What already exists from other stories? What is implied in that requirement? And are they allowed to save, or do they save and immediately post it? And can they delete one? And all those different things, if they weren't in that one workflow that was designed, and that is all that got put into the user story for them to work on, you end up with half developed software. And then you get back to, this doesn't meet requirements. Well, I did what the requirements said or what I interpreted. It looks just like the picture. So aren't I done? And anytime you can avoid that. So hearing you describe all of these details and iterating through and understanding that first pass doesn't get to the end state. You have to keep going around. And I like having the specific, this is why we're going through it again. We're going to go deeper on this part until we get to it. Is 4 rounds always the thing? Or do you science go back and like, oh, we got to go do it again?
No, it's never the thing. Does it ever actually happen the way that I want it to happen in my head? No. I'm just talking to you about my dreams.
Right. This is the textbook definition of the...
This is the textbook canonical definition. No, you always adapt it to the situation. That is to your timeline, to your product, to what your needs are. It is... People look at the Orca process and they're like, are you kidding? 15 steps of process. Like, I've been so burned by process. I don't want that kind of rigidity. You can think about it as a bag of tricks that go really well in that order, but you can mix them up. A lot of times people will mix up the prioritization and the requirements round. So go through discovery, then prioritize, and then just write your requirements on what's been prioritized. That is a really nice little shortcut. The purist in me is like, well, how are you going to prioritize if you haven't gotten a really good idea on what your stuff is? You'll do a better job prioritizing if you take and all this entire process, I'm talking days, weeks, not months, depending on how complex your system is, but taking like 2 to 3 weeks to do this every 4 or 5 years. I might be underplaying it a little bit. Again, it depends on how complex your system is, but a lot of this stuff, the good news is we're talking about these concepts that don't change. If we think about those pace layers, this is the bottom of these pace layers. Like when I work with these companies on, let's say, for example, so one of my colleagues works in farming. Shout out to Allie O'Fisher. So it's a pig farm. This has been done the same way. Unfortunately, it's not beautiful how it's done, but it's been done the same way for decades. All right. And even if like certain things change, like they're going to have pens, they're going to have barns, they're going to have pigs, there's going to be farm hands. Those things are not going to change. In marketing, we've got campaigns, we've got segments, we've got people in those customers in those segments, right? Like the things actually don't change. So if we can get that right, we take, oh my gosh, an entire month to really figure this out. And then it can pay dividends for years, if not even decades for your company. Like, what is that worth to get clarity, to get everybody speaking the same language too? Just calling these things the same thing, right? I mean, if you're only like, sometimes I'll say, just do the first step of the process. Like, just build a glossary, of the concepts so you're not using different words for the same thing or the same word for different things, because it's really hard to build complicated software when you're doing that, when your language is messy.
Right. I mean, that goes to, you mentioned domain-driven design earlier, and that's like one of the core tenets of domain-driven design. You have bounded contexts with ubiquitous language, and the ubiquitous language is ubiquitous within that smaller bounded context. I work on financial systems and accounting. We have accounts payable and we have accounts receivable. They both have invoices. If I just say invoice, which way is the money flowing? But if I'm in the accounts payable department, I only know that those are invoices that come in that I have to pay. And if I'm in accounts receivable, those are invoices that I'm going to be sending out to get paid. They don't say an accounts receivable invoice and an accounts payable invoice. But within that structure, you have to put the bounded context around so that invoice has the right direction implied. And that's, I guess, getting back to your idea that you just get the language right, come up with the glossary, come up with the terms and get to the same language. And anytime you can be speaking the language of the business in the design and in the software, and it just gets embedded, it removes so many problems with communication.
100%. And I'll just add to that sometimes we say, oh, we need to use the language of the end user. And that is true to a certain extent. But as professionals, we need to be a little bit more precise with our language than how things are talked about colloquially. So this is getting into this concept of tree systems. Maybe you know the word for this. I searched, I was like, what is the technical term for this? In our community, we just came up with the word tree system. So basically, this is going from a general to a specific thing, not objects and instances, general to specific objects. So an example I give all the time is you have movie. So a movie is The Little Mermaid 2022, I think, or 2023. All right. And then you have the movie at a theater. All right. So then you have an instance of that would be The Little Mermaid at Mountain Cinemas. And then you have a showtime. You have The Little Mermaid at Mountain Cinemas at 8 p.m. on Friday. And that's the thing that can be sold out. That's the only thing that has a sold out status, right? Another one has whether it is in, 3D or not. What do they call that? Or Dolby Vision or, whatever, right? Or is handicap accessible, right? So that's information about the theater that gets passed down. Now, the movie poster is probably only going to sit at the movie object because probably Hollywood is, this is getting into permissions too. The people that can edit the movie object, where the movie poster lives and the runtime lives and the release date lives and the official synopsis lives, the person that is editing the showtimes at Mountain Cinemas should not be able to edit the movie object. They should only be able to edit the showtime object. So we've got these three objects that are all highly connected to each other, but they are different things with relationships. So you've got movie at theater, and you've got showtime. And it colloquially, I'm not going to say I'm going to a showtime. I'm going to say I'm going to the movies. What I mean is I'm going to a showtime. So that is one example. And that's where OOUXers get into that beautiful wordplay of figuring that out and realizing, oh, we're confounding these three concepts into one. And what we can do then is split that out and make it really, really clear also to the end user. You're looking at a showtime versus a movie, and I can easily now navigate. I'm looking at the showtime. Now let me navigate up to the main movie so I can see all the other theaters it's playing at. So this is also a navigational construct as well. Is there a technical term for this thing that I'm describing? This general to specific?
Nothing comes to my mind, but that hierarchy is definitely an aspect of, I think you got to data taxonomy and how do you structure your data and how are the relationships stored? And yes, that winds up to the problem of I could just create the movie table in the database and then what goes in there? If you start putting showtimes at theaters in the movie table, that just smells wrong. So, okay, well, I have a movie and I have a theaters and I have a showtime table. The engineer is automatically going to, how do I structure the data? But that isn't the same way as how do I talk about it and what does the design look like? And you mentioned the person editing the showtimes. That's a different user interface to that same data. And that's a different workflow. That's different UX design. That's maybe more data you need to have in the system. Maybe it's a different view of the data. Like, I don't want to have all of that data visible to every user who's going to book the showtime. They're going to buy a ticket. But maybe the person who's at the theater needs to be able to edit more data and see additional things, like how many seats are in the theater, or you can't buy seat 7B because the chair's broken or something.
Exactly. So you get that. And also, you get the roll up data too. So some of like, if on the movie, if I'm an admin, I may be able to see things like the gross sales, right? Across all theaters, across all of America, right? If I'm admin in Fandango or something like that. So I can get these like high level analytics, all right, that gets passed from the showtime to the movie at the theater all the way up to the movie. And you can basically then, from a user experience perspective, I can start really thinking, okay, like who gets to see what on these different objects? How is the end user going to navigate? But like also, who can do what to what object? What are our permissions as far as visibility and actions are concerned? And then, like, where does this information belong? This is also a content editing question, too. So, like, if we're putting whether it's handicap accessible, like, is handicap accessible? Is that on the theater? Is that on the theater room? Like the theater, now I'm using theater in two different ways, right? Like, is it in the theaters in Mountain Cinemas, or is it on Mountain Cinema Theater 3? Right? Like, is theater 3 handicap accessible, but theater 1 is not? Or is just the entire theater handicap accessible? So if I want to say this showtime is handicap accessible, where am I pulling that information down from? And if it changes, how do I make sure that the user's not having to change it in a whole bunch of places, right? And we get that nice trickle down effect.
And that's what I think we're getting to, is that if you think about all these things up front for the really core concepts, like those are established terms. Like, you're not inventing the idea of a movie theater for this thing that we're coming up with. Like, we think those exist, and we're just trying to model our system to support that. You have to get those right day one, or it's not going to evolve. Now, you can prioritize it and say, hey, this is all we need to handle for day one. We're not going to handle handicap accessibility for, horrible reasons. We're going to deal with that in version 2. But maybe we don't release the MVP to everybody and it's just in beta test. That's where you get to the question I want to have, is how do you revise the design? Like, say we did almost everything up front, or do you wait until things are out in the real world and come back, and how do you make the changes? And what does that look like? Do you just go back to the Miro board and the Airtable and move the stickies around?
That's a great question. And that really does come into, it depends. It comes into that prioritization round of like, okay, so this is what we're building now. And what I will say about changes is we want what we're building now to be, I'll quote John Gall, because I always quote John Gall. You want to create a simple system that works before you create a complex system that works. Like, you can't really create a complex system that works until you've already created a simple system that works. So I really encourage companies to think about that, of like, what is your simple system that works? But also, have you sketched out your complex system? So sticky notes are really cheap, right? Moving stuff around in Airtable and Notion and Miro is actually pretty cheap. So I always encourage people to like build your 18-month plan. Like, this is not huge design up front because we're not designing all the screens. We're just thinking things through so we don't paint ourselves into a corner and have a bunch of tech and UX debt. So we can go and say, we know that, like, from using the architecture metaphor, we know that there's going to be a porch over here. I would love a porch over here. We're not going to build the porch now, but I'm going to go ahead and do the grading in a way that the porch can be built there. Or we're going to go ahead and stub in the plumbing for this third bathroom. We're not going to build out the third bathroom right now, but like, we want a third bathroom in the basement. So let's just go ahead and get the plumbing in there. And we're making our lives so much easier later on. And that's what OOUX can really, like, even if things change and we say like, oh, maybe it's going to be a wet bar and not a bathroom downstairs. Like, things might end up changing, but to have a really good idea of where you are going helps you avoid that tech debt. And you are nodding. So I think you're on the same page about this. The other thing that I was going to say, so when it comes to actually changing in your documentation, this is a really good question. Now, it depends on what that source of truth has become. I love the object map to be a source of truth. I think it's a great way to document requirements. It's totally scalable. Every little bit and piece of the design gets its own, if it's Airtable or Notion, gets its own page that you could add structure to it. So you could basically add, it's like meta, it's like taking it like one level deeper where your attributes actually have backend attributes, like whether this field is required or not, and things like that. The maximum character length for this field. So you can get into a whole lot of detail with that. When you have that and it's documented and you're all kind of in agreement on it, then our technical side can go ahead and start building out technical architecture, can start building out maybe some of the things that's going to be a little bit harder, build out those APIs, figure out some, okay, we're going to want to be pulling information from this nested object and then from this nested object. Okay, what are our performance considerations there? You can start doing that without any screens, which is a beautiful thing. So I can go ahead and start designing some screens while you're working out some of the hairy parts of the technical architecture, getting that all set up. And then you can see screens, and the screens are no surprise, right? Because it's like, oh, yeah, this is what we talked about. So now you've released that. The good news is if you're using object-oriented UX, it's going to be very naturally intuitive. And these are things that just are the truth about the world. All right. So what we are doing is so much in object-oriented UX, and I think a lot in technical architecture and software architecture, is we're trying to reflect the truth of how the world works. And what is this business? How do things work? If it's movies, okay, like I'm not changing the way that Hollywood works and distributes their movies, right? And I really realized this when I was working on election results. Like, I'm not designing how the information architecture of how our election system works. I'm trying to figure out what is true about this system and how do I reflect it in the best way possible. And if you're doing that, there's not a lot of changes that have to happen after that. Like that 80-20 rule, instead of like major issues that you've launched that you're going to have to go and rewrite and rethink and rework, you're going to have very, very little of that because you're just like, this is just a reflection of how the world works. Now, when you do have those changes, yes, how do you decide to change this? Do you change them in the screens and then you go and change them over in Airtable or Notion? That would be up to the team. What becomes the source of truth? Is the sticky note Miro board? That probably is just a sketch. Does it end up going into Confluence or Jira or something like people have created object maps in Confluence before? So does it go into another system and that becomes the source of truth? So it's a tough question. And I am considering that as I consider what the custom software would look like for the Orca process, where these things, you don't have such a big issue with change management.
Well, I think that goes through a lot of stuff. I think there's a lot of analogies, like I said, to how developers are thinking about this. So I love having the designer perspective meshing really well and just getting more people involved in a collaborative process up front. If people want to know more about OOUX, where can they go or how can they contact you?
There's OOUX.com. We've got so many free resources. You can go to OOUX.com/start. Connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm Sophia Prater. I love it when people connect with me on LinkedIn. And we also have the OOUX forum. So that's forum.OOUX.com. It is free to join there. We have an entire space for OOUX and developers. So we already have some developers in there. And I honestly think that this is just going to be such a good tool for software architects to really kind of be able to document it's hard to say delightful, but I would go ahead and say this is the closest thing to delightful documentation that you can find, because documentation can ever really be delightful, but we're talking color coded, we're talking really, really methodical, and it brings a lot of stress out of the documentation and making sure all those decisions were clearly documented. Does a really, really good job of that, some of the artifacts. So send people to those places, and I am excited to connect on LinkedIn and in the OOUX forum.
Well, I will be sure to get those added to the show notes when this publishes. I need to give a shout out to one of my coworkers, Brad Bonham, who introduced me to OOUX, connected me to Sophia. So thanks, Brad, for that. And Sophia, thank you again for talking with me today on the InfoQ podcast.
Cheers. Thanks so much for having me.
And listeners, we hope you'll join us again next week. Thanks.